Welcome everybody, and welcome to the first Oxford Student for Happiness event. Just to give you a quick background, Students for Happiness was set up back in 2012 in London, and it was set up by a group of students who felt that at university we're educated in a really wide range of subjects, but often happiness and well-being tend to not really be explored from an intellectual point of view. So one of the Oxford Students for Happiness team, Benny, his brother Arthur, was one of these founding students. And when chatting about it, Benny realised that whilst many excellent campaigns and organisations do exist in Oxford, there's still actually a gap for what we want to offer, which is the chance and opportunity to hear world-class experts approach topics of mindfulness and well-being from a wide variety of angles. So a group of us got together and we decided to make that happen. We want to give mental health and well-being the platform that we think it deserves. And that's where we are now. We're really excited to bring Students for Happiness to Oxford and to create a movement for positive social change and impact. And that's a phrase that is overused often, but actually it is something that we need to realise that we are young people, and the people here today and the people at our university and young people in general are the opinion makers, and they're going to have the opinions and be the policy makers of the future. So it is important that we think about these issues. And on that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bostock, who will be chairing today's evening discussion. Sophie holds Students for Happiness really close to her heart because she was another of those students that founded Students for Happiness back in London. At that time, she was completing her PhD, which was based on happiness and the heart. It studied mechanisms that linked well-being and work stress to cardiovascular disease. And then through trials and intervention studies, actually found that the power of technology in health is vast. And after that got involved in a startup which is now really successful and won Startup of the Year 2014. So Sophie's going to help give a background to each speaker before they give a presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for the group discussion. A massive thank you to Sophie for being here. It's really important to us and our team, but it's also going to make this evening so much more interesting and thought-provoking for everybody else here, so thanks. So I'll hand over to you now.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Super. Well, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I would say that I am absolutely delighted to be in Oxford and to see so many of you here to study the question, what does it mean to be happy? This is not just a platitude. I am genuinely pleased to see you. I'm very much hoping that you will be able to avoid some of the mistakes that I made in the tricky transition from university into the real world. I cocked it up badly. In fact, so badly that I had to go back and do it all again. So take note, and you may survive unscathed. I actually studied medicine at Nottingham University, and for all of about 3 years, I had a jolly nice time. I played hockey, I drank excessively. I did actually manage to pass some exams. I also avoided any lecture that was entitled Psychology or Behavioural Medicine, perceiving that this was an entirely airy-fairy topic, not one to be studied by serious scientists. Give me an equation, glomerular filtration rates, all that sort of thing, and I was there at the back, throwing things and eating Skittles. What happened was, I got to the fourth year, where you get into hospitals, and all of a sudden, I was introduced to real people, sick people, and I found that I stopped enjoying myself. Suddenly, I was faced with life or death decisions, patients and families who were stressed, scared, and often desperate. And I just didn't have the tools to cope. And I have to say, in retrospect, that I became quite unhappy. I didn't even stop to think why. I just knew it wasn't for me, and I quit. So I threw myself into the first graduate development scheme that would accept me. I told myself that it was going to be absolutely fine. I'd just earn some money, I'd get on the career ladder, and that was what was the most important thing. But even with all of those things on paper, I still knew it wasn't a good fit. So I spent a few years going from one role to another. I was doing okay, I was earning money, my parents weren't worried about me, but I knew that there was something missing. And in a fit of February doldrums, I applied for a PhD in public health. The reason being that I thought if I could finally call myself doctor and get some new stationery, perhaps I would have what I'd always craved. Months later, it's about 10 months to be precise, I was 3 months into an incredibly sensible and incredibly dull PhD. I was forced to accept that once again it was not working. Fortunately, before I left to join the circus, I found out that you could actually study happiness. Officially, there was a whole science around it. So I switched topics and effectively spent the next 3 years studying the question of what it means to be happy and how to learn the tricks of the trade. Over the following 3 years, unbeknownst to them, I was fortunate to discover the work of our 3 panellists. So there was Nic, who was at the New Economics Foundation then, who had managed to summarise the secrets of well-being into a form compelling enough that even policymakers could understand it. Miriam, who was one of the first of a new genre of psychologists to explain how the science of positive emotions could be applied to combat mental ill health. And Professor Mark Williams, then Director of Oxford Mindfulness Centre, whose clinical practice and research has transformed our understanding of mindfulness as an evidence-based therapeutic technique. So, on to the real nitty-gritty of the evening. Each speaker is going to have about 15 to 20 minutes to present, followed by 1 or 2 questions, and we'll then bring all 3 speakers together for a general panel discussion. I would encourage you to think about questions as we go along, maybe jot them down so that we have plenty of taxing ammunition for them at the end. At this point, I will pause to let you switch off your phones. Thank you. Now on to our first speaker, Nic Marks. Now, I first heard Nic speak in January 2012, you don't know this, in January 2012 at an Action for Happiness event, and it was the first time that I had heard someone present a truly compelling economic argument for both measuring well-being and taking action at a personal, community and policy level. I was very inspired, and it's had quite a big impact on my personal and professional life. His list of publications is too numerous to list, but notable among them is the trailblazing Happy Planet Index and the TED book, The Happiness Manifesto. Most recently, he founded Happiness Works, an organisation which helps companies like mine to measure and prioritise workplace well-being. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Nic Marks.
Thanks very much. Oh, I've got to turn this on. Is that working now? No? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. Well, I'm not going to talk too much about policy, but you can ask me questions around it. But I am called the founder for the Centre of Wellbeing at the New Economics Foundation. About 2001, I started working on well-being. It was a word that had come into the UK policy arena in the Local Government Act 2000. And if any of you are interested in a career in think tanks, then basically think tanks compete for meaning. And so the brief to me was to drive some meaning under the word well-being. And I had sort of even longer hair then, and I sat in a corner for about 2 years and everyone thought I was mad. But being an applied statistician, I wanted to put statistics underneath what we did. And over a period of time at NEF, we created work that actually did start to shape government policy on what well-being is and how you can measure it and how you can promote it. And because it's Oxford Happiness Week, I wanted to talk more about the practical side of some work we did on what actually creates human happiness, human well-being, and what you can do in your lives. So that's what I'm going to mainly focus on today, and we call it the 5 ways to well-being. But before I get there, I want to first of all think about happiness and what happiness looks like and what happiness is. And this is actually my best friend, Pete. And we can see that Pete is happy in this picture. He's smiling, his eyes are wrinkling, and he's genuinely beaming out of this photograph. And I can see quite a lot of you have this instant reaction of smiling back at a photograph, even though he can't actually see you. But and the thing is that happiness is a universal human experience. That every human being on this planet experiences happiness, recognizes happiness. And from that sort of understanding, we must appreciate that it is functional for human beings as a species, as organisms. There must be a reason why we've evolved to experience happiness. And all of our emotions are functional. We can immediately understand that anger and fear are part of the fight and flight mechanism. That when we feel angry, someone's overstepped a mark, something feels unfair, and we have a rising energy inside us. We physically feel emotions. One of the differences between emotions and cognition is that we have bodily experiences that are accompanied with emotions. And we start to take actions to avoid a future violation of a norm. Fear is about an imminent threat to our well-being, whether it's a snake slithering on the ground or whatever. We are going to take action against that. So one functional action is to freeze and hope that the predator doesn't notice us. Another is to run away or to gather in a group to defend ourselves. But we have functional actions that come from a fear mechanism. Sadness is a little bit more complex in some ways, where we experience as a big draining of energy. And sadness is normally about the loss of a support system. Why should we be drained of energy when we lose a support system? Well, probably over a long period of time, it's paid us to slow down when we lose a support system, and to, in a sense, reflect on what we've lost and how we could refine that in our lives. So something like grief is a very natural human experience, and it is functional for us to slow down. So if you've just lost a support system, which you might call a romantic partner, actually it's not highly functional to go out the next night and try and find another one. Better to slow down for a while and reflect on what you want for your next partner. So all happiness is highly functional to us as individuals, but there's something else going on with happiness. And the reason that Pete is actually happy in this picture is because he's with me. And happiness is a very social experience. In fact, if you walk down a street laughing to yourself, you look slightly crazy. Whereas if you're walking and laughing with somebody else, it is the most natural human experience on the planet. And it's a clue to another evolutionary purpose around happiness, which is that happiness helps us build relationships. That it is a signal that we can be approached. If I smile, you can approach me. If I scowl, it's avoid me. So the way that humans have gathered together, happiness is a huge part of that. And our positive emotions are a huge part of that. And we also find all sorts of ways that we coordinate emotions. So this family are all laughing together. We do this with all emotional experiences, but particularly with happiness. It's very contagious. In fact, there's research showing that emotions travel around a group to about 3 degrees of separation. So we know this idea that most people on the planet are only 6 degrees of separation away from anybody else. Though Facebook's suggesting it might only be 4.5, actually, looking at new networking. But anyway, six people away. Well, emotions will travel around a group to about 3 degrees of separation. So my happiness will affect my friend, which will affect their friend, and will affect the third person. Obviously, the effects get smaller, but they're still there, and they're still statistically significant in large studies. Particularly this piece of work called the Framlington Heart Study, which is in New England, and they've been tracking people in this population for a long time. And there's a very good little book called Connected, a TED talk called Connected by Nicholas Kostakis, which starts going into some of that. So happiness is highly, highly functional. And it helps us achieve other goals. There's all sorts of evidence that people who are happier are effectively more successful in lots of ways, including living longer as it happens. Maybe live 7 to 12 years longer, happier people than unhappy people. More likely to get married, more likely to earn more money after 10 years. So if you smile at university and your college photograph shows you smiling, that becomes a predictor, not literally whether you smiled in the camera, but the fact that you were smiling is a sort of person who is smiling a lot. You're more likely to be earning more money 10 years later. All sorts of things. And in a way, it reverses the equation, the dominant equation we have in our society, which is that if you work hard and you're successful, you will be happy. If you work hard, you can be happy on the weekends, you can be happy on holiday, you can be happy in retirement, But actually, the evidence from happiness is actually, sod it, be happy now, and good things will come. And that's quite dramatic change. So the question really becomes, how do we become happier? Because, it's good, we like it, it's good for our organisations, it's good for society, we become better citizens, all sorts of ways. So we were asked to do a piece of work when I was at New Economics Foundation, and the idea of it was that we have this concept that we all know in public health, which is we should eat 5 fruit and vegetables a day. I was in the Government Office of Science doing another project for them, and we were presenting on a measurement project, and there was some fruit in the middle of the table. And I literally said to the guy, we need the equivalent of 5 fruit and vegetables a day, but for well-being. And he looked at me rather quizzically and he goes, we do, yeah. And actually my budget's closed at the end of this week on this project, but I've got £10,000 left there. So if you give me a project by Friday for less than £10,000, you can do a project on that. And that's how we won the work to do the 5 ways to wellbeing. He got one on Thursday for £9,600. And it was all part of something, I thought I had a slide here. Yeah, the Foresight Project. It's a big, big project in government. And it is called what it says on the tin. Foresight is to look beyond this term of office. Most governments get stuck in what can they do in this term of office. And in fact, there's even an expression, everyone knows NIMBYism, not in my backyard. In policy, we have an expression which is NIMTO, which means not in my term of office. And policymakers will try and kick difficult problems into the future and not deal with them. And Foresight is a part of government that tries to look beyond this term of office. And they did a project in 2008 on mental capital and well-being. I was perchance the deputy lead on well-being. Professor Felicia Hubbard, who's from the other place, Cambridge, she was the lead, and because I was working with her on lots of projects, I managed to sneak in as a deputy lead. And that's how we got some projects. So we started to come up with what are the big drivers, and we're looking at evidence here that we can see that people who do these activities become happier. And the first one of those is to connect, which is that our social relationships are the most important thing for our happiness and well-being. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. Humans are social creatures. Happiness is a social emotion. Every one of you in this room was actually, literally, physically created through a relationship. Your parents got together and you were born through a relationship. You were brought up in a network of relationships, your family, your schools, your communities, and we are relational beings. And relationships are the cornerstone of our happiness. So, to just make this bring this to yourselves, I'm not going to do formal exercises, but just take 10, 15 seconds reflecting on this question and think about it in the last couple of weeks. But what helps you stay close to the people that are really important to you in your life? Just ponder that a moment. You're waving a phone at me. That helps you stay close to people in a way. But do you take the time to nourish the relationships that are important to you? And do you continue to do that? So connect is the first one. The second one is to be active, which is that physical activity is very related to happiness and well-being. And luckily for a guy like me who's not a creature of speed, it's not so much the sweaty physical exercise that does it, but it's actually walking will do it. So I actually wear one of these Fitbit things now, Jawbone. I look to see whether I do my 10,000 steps a day, which is the sort of target, but it can be lots of other things. But if you're in a bad mood, actually the fastest way out of a bad mood is to move your body. It can be gardening, it can be dancing, it can be anything. But physical activity is great for our happiness and well-being. So think about what ways of being active do you really enjoy? Because you need to find things which are going to give you pleasure in your physical activity, otherwise you won't do them. Or you'll do them for a period and keep them going. But just, ask yourself that question. The third one is to take notice. This gets us into the space of mindfulness, of cognitive behavioural therapy, of reflection, of thinking about your life and noticing what's going on around us and outside of us. And that sort of activity helps us reflect on things that are meaningful to us, as well as just taking pleasure in the aesthetics of life. So, in a sense, just for a minute, and I think we're going to do some more mindfulness later, and I'm not an expert on mindfulness, but sort of the thing is to just slow down, stop, breathe, notice what's going on for you, and just think what's on your mind right now. And the next one is keep learning. You're in a learning establishment. And I would say that there are lots of our formal learning establishments which are not well-being generating. A lot of our schools have become exam factories and are stressful places, and the joy of learning is perhaps kicked out of us. But learning new things, we are novelty-seeking creatures. We are creatures that like to expand our possibilities. That helps us survive and thrive in lots of ways. And there's lots of evidence that learning throughout the whole life course is really good for our happiness and well-being. That even older people who keep learning, they have the brain elasticity to do that, and they have much better health outcomes if they do. And one of my favourite named papers in psychology is called "You Can Teach an Old Dog New Tricks." and that older people still have brain elasticity, right into their 80s. It might be decreased in its functioning, but it's still there, still can learn. And I keep trying to tell my father that, but he doesn't seem to listen. But learning is great for us. And so just think about what you've learned recently or tried out for the first time. It's good to just keep novelty in your life, keep learning. It doesn't have to be formal. It can be learning to cook a new dish, fix a bike even. And the final one is give, which is that actually giving is great for our well-being. The Dalai Lama says if you want other people to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And in a way, again, evolution working in an amazing way, that we actually feel a reward in ourselves for when we are generous to other people. Helps the group survive, and we feel good with it too. Lots of experiments there that you can set people off and give some people $20 to spend on themselves, which is like retail therapy. Some to spend $20 on somebody else. That's sort of, generosity therapy. The people at the end of the day who've given to other people are much happier than those that spent the money themselves, and they are still happier a week later. So generosity has a much longer half-life, if you want, of happiness. It's going to last a lot longer than spending money on yourself, which will work in the short term. But giving is great for it. And so, think, about, what have you done recently to make someone else happy or to help others? So these 5 things, connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give, are what we call the 5 ways to well-being. They are complementary. We'll have strengths. We'll have some that we naturally prefer, and we'll have some challenges. So ever since I've done this research, I've noticed that be active is my weakness, and I've tried to do it more and more in my life. Whereas if I'm not learning, then I'm pretty quickly I'm frustrated if I'm not learning. So I've got quite a quick driver on that. And we'll be different, and we'll have different ways of it. And one of the things to try to articulate with the 3 dots after each of these expressions is that you don't want to make this a prescriptive space and tell people to do these things. These are an invitation. So the 3 dots are supposed to make connect like connect rather than connect. And that actually is what's interesting about how the 5 ways have been used, which is that they've been used very, very widely because I think they're very permissive and they're starting to allow people to experiment. So Action for Happiness, which we mentioned earlier, have slightly changed the 5 ways into their first 5 of their 10 keys for happier living. Projects in London called Do It Yourself Happiness have used them. They added the 6th one, which was around planet, which is around environmental stuff. In Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand, they took the 5 ways, they called them the winning ways. They were used a lot in Christchurch after the earthquake as a simple way to start getting community projects off the line. This guy created a new word, photography. He actually had some budget for getting people to walk, to move more, but what he did was he bought them digital cameras to play with, and he made them walk to places miles away to take beautiful photographs. They didn't notice they were walking, they were taking notice, they were learning something. He was using energy from some of the other 5 ways to get the moving more. He did that all in Norfolk. Schools have taken the 5 ways. They've rewritten Red Riding Hood's story, and Mr. Wolf starts to learn to dance and have his hair done by Red Riding Hood. And so they've started to, they made the whole project around the 5 ways. The kids did the drawings, they did the production, they sold the books and everything. In Norway, they are now in every kindergarten in the Oslo area. They've made it all into Norwegian. I particularly like Give here, which is these bunny fighting over something. Kindergartens are a great way for promoting public mental health because the parents are very involved, so the kids start promoting things to the parents. So they had this project where the kids actually took these postcards, they started posting them in random letterboxes around the Oslo area with little messages of happiness on them. So there's just lots of ways they've been used, and you can search on the internet and they just have gone spectacularly ballistic as an idea. And what I think they do, the 5 ways, and I can just keep clicking through all these ways they've been used, is that they start to unpack happiness and well-being to the right level. They leave lots of room for experimentation, but they give enough structure that people can start to see how they're being used. They're being used to redesign high streets in some projects. What would a high street look for if it wasn't just a commercial space, but it was a well-being space too? We've worked with clients in our business around 5 ways to well-being. This is actually in Dubai, and that's take notice in Arabic if any of you are Arabic speakers. So those are the 5 ways. They're sort of useful in our personal lives, but actually, strangely, because they weren't designed for this, they're fantastic for communities, schools, systems, universities, about thinking about what are the sort of types of activities we can do that happiness will emerge out of. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Awesome. Look, we've got sort of 2 minutes for questions for Nic before we move on to the next speaker. Does anyone have any burning questions at this point?
No, that's good. Get to the next. Oh, wait, there's one. Yeah.
I can't see you.
Yeah, anyway, yeah.
Keep talking.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you have to have a happiness baseline for the 5 ways to well-being to actually start to work? Or, I mean, are they going to work for someone who's in a profound depression, or do you have to be in a state of kind of equanimity?
It's a really fair question. They really are designed as a whole population intervention, rather than as a specific intervention for people with, serious mental health disorders, even common mental health disorders. So if you're stuck in a rut, telling people to be active is a little bit paternalistic. And they have been used in some of those projects to try and get some of the energy going in that space, but obviously that requires a different intervention. So they're more to move the whole population, mean and average, than they are specific intervention. They have been used in that context, but people who are using mental health services don't necessarily find them massively helpful. You really need some sense of agency to get into that space, and so if people have really not got a sense of agency, they're not going to find it easy to get in that space, and they're going to need different interventions. Yeah.
So we also used them at UCL, so a proper RCT with UCL students and staff.
Yeah.
Taught them the 5 ways,
Yeah.
and it was pretty effective.
Yeah.
Any more questions for Nic at this point? No,
Great, thank you.
Save them up. Okay, awesome, thank you. I'll let you fiddle. Right. Wonderful. So, next up. Oh, Miriam, I didn't know how you say your surname.
Oh, Akhtar.
Akhtar, yes. This is Miriam Akhtar. Now, she was one of the first positive psychologists in the UK. We haven't met before, but I had read about Miriam in a book called The World Book of Happiness, which was a collection of insights from just 100 global experts in happiness, which was presented to 200 world leaders by the President of the EU with a request to put well-being on the national agendas. She started work as an award-winning journalist and has developed and applied her skills in the mastery of communication as an author, a speaker, a lecturer and a trainer. Miriam described her life purpose as to put people on the path to happiness, so I can't really think of anyone better to take our next slot. And introducing Miriam.
Hello, we seem to have a little problem with the slides, so we're just going to be testing our resilience here. This is a positive psychology intervention in action. So while we're trying to get the slides back, I'll just say, yeah, I am a positive psychologist. So I'm one of the people who've been tasked to make the world a happier place, parallel to the way that clinical psychologists have made the world a less unhappy place. And that really highlights the way that positive psychology works. Have we got that?
We're starting again.
Ah,
Don't
there you
worry,
go.
just keep going.
So this is an opportunity to practice your 5 ways to well-being. Incidentally, which I use a lot. I use it in my training. We play a game of 5 ways to well-being bingo. See how many of the 5 ways to well-being we can tick. And I also happen to meditate to Mark's voice. Yeah, not in person, on a CD. Right, we're just waiting for that to come up.
What we could do,
Yes.
we could possibly switch around
Yeah.
Mark and Miriam, since Mark doesn't have any slides.
Ah, let's do
Would
that.
Be okay?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Sorry, Mark.
Right.
And then I will give you. Okay, lovely. I'm going to change to the published agenda. We're now going to move on to Professor Mark Williams. Now, what can I say about Mark? He doesn't know this, but I actually heard him speak at Cheltenham Science Festival in 2012. and where he was on a panel with David Sillitoe, who's a BBC correspondent who learned mindfulness and was extremely impressed by it. And I was sitting next to somebody who was listening to Mark in his kind of quiet, understated presentation style, and this lady just sighed and said, "Oh, I wish he was my doctor." That's very sweet. So Mark is officially retired, so I'm especially pleased that he's decided to come and join us this evening. I'm not sure that he's taking retirement too seriously. He spent many years researching and writing about psychological models for the treatment of depression and suicidal behaviour. With colleagues John Teasdale and Zindan Siegel, he developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for the prevention of relapse and recurrence in depression. In 2011, he also published Mindfulness, a practical guide to finding peace in a frantic world, with Danny Penman, which I mention because it's a really great introduction to mindfulness to people who haven't come across it before. And I hope that he will give us an essence of his introduction to mindfulness this evening. So please help me welcoming Professor Mark Williams.
So thank you very much for that introduction. I want to talk about just two or three areas. First of all, why is well-being important? And Nic's covered that, I think, really well. But I want to just tease apart why happiness is not the opposite of unhappiness, why they seem to go, to some extent, they're orthogonal to each other, although if you take a whole population survey, you obviously get high correlations between levels of unhappiness and depression on the one hand, and the lack of happiness on the other. But in any one section of the population, they tend to be orthogonal to each other. And then I want to try to address why has paying attention, which is what mindfulness is about in a sense, why has that got anything to do with this at all? Because that seems to be, in one sense, rather irrelevant. Well, so first of all, why well-being is not just about feeling good. You can be in a happy mood, but by well-being, we mean something slightly more than just feeling good. We mean the ability to solve problems, to think clearly, feelings of being loved, for example. And this idea that well-being is somehow not just the opposite, or happiness is not just the opposite of unhappiness, emerges from some of the research that have been done by Nic and his colleagues. He mentioned Felicia Huppert at Cambridge, for example, and she has analysed the Medical Research Council's 1946 cohort. That was people born in 1946. And they were assessed at various points throughout their life. They've been assessed. And in one of these points, between about 13 and 15 years old, the teachers of those children born in 1946 were asked about the children, and as part of those questions rated the positive qualities, whether these children were generally happy. Now, 1946 is a long time ago, so Martin Richards and Felicia have been able to follow that cohort up, and they find that those ratings by the teacher of how happy the kids were correlated with a lot of health outcomes later on, and were able to protect those children later on in their lives from a great deal of what we might see as being a great deal of unhappiness and stress. Now that happened even though they also knew how depressed these children were, and that correlates, but this correlates even more. So in other words, it contributes a different aspect to the variance. This just how happy these children were at the age of 13 and 15. And there have been recent studies of telling the same story. So the amount of happiness in a group of children between 13 and 17 years old, just how happy they were. Now they used some items from a self-esteem scale, but also from an unhappiness scale, but that unhappiness scale had 4 happiness items had crept into it. And it was those 4 happiness items in there which actually predicted between 18 and 27 a lot of outcomes, including risky behaviours. And again, that was after you've taken account of how depressed or sad or anxious these children were. So happiness is important to understand, and well-being not just as being the opposite of unhappiness. But what I'd like to talk about today is, what has mindfulness got to do with any of this? When you imagine what happiness is as an idea and its opposite, unhappiness, as an idea, you tend to think that if you're unhappy, you need to move yourself in the direction of happiness. And as Nic said, there's lots of evidence of how you can do that. But mindfulness, from an old Pali word just simply meaning awareness or non-forgetfulness, is about paying attention. It's not really about trying to shift yourself from unhappiness to happiness at all. And it helps to see, why has that got to do anything with it? And one of the reasons why it helps is because a lot of happiness, we think, is contingent on how things go. So, for example, if I asked you to think of 6 things that you're looking forward to, goals for the next year, then you'd probably come up with a number of things that are your goals, things that would make you feel happy, things that would make you feel like you were successful as a person. And if then I asked you some supplementary questions about that, for example, how happy would you still be if you didn't achieve those goals? How much of a sense of fulfillment would you have if you didn't achieve those goals? Then people find it easy to answer those questions, and you can develop a metric called contingent self-esteem or contingent happiness. In other words, not just how happy are you now, but how happy would you be if that goal was fulfilled, but importantly, how happy would you still be if you couldn't achieve that goal? So you can ask people about all these different goals. You can develop quite a reliable metric of the contingency of self-esteem and the contingency of happiness. It turns out that that contingent element is highly correlated with how naturally mindful you are. And that means that if you are very contingent, so your happiness is totally dependent on things turning out the way you want, it turns out that you also will be slightly more judgmental about yourself. You'll be slightly less likely to notice things around you and act with awareness. You'll be less likely to observe sort of normal beauties and pleasures other people see around them. You can't articulate your emotions quite as readily, and you have increasing cognitive failures. In other words, things you tend to make slips of action. And those turn out to be the five aspects of mindfulness. Mindfulness consists, well, we know what mindfulness is, awareness, but it's easier to explain it if you look at its opposite. That's mindlessness. That's when you end up at the wrong lecture theatre because that's the more habitual one, or you go past your goal, you don't test your food, you're always rushing around, and you're only ever listening to anybody else with one ear, the other ear is trying to pick other things. It turns out that people that are mindless like that and aren't very mindful have a fight-flight system that is almost constantly on the on or alert. It's chronically overactive. The amygdala is slightly overactive. So rather than talk any more about mindfulness, I thought it might be useful just to experience some mindfulness. And if you want to play along with this, then we'll meditate for a minute or two. And if you don't, then just sit there, closing your eyes, go to sleep, whatever you'd like, because nobody knows whether you're meditating or not. This is one of the benefits of it. So if for the moment you just sit, put any books down that you've got on your lap, and feel the feet on the floor. So notice what the sensations, the direct sensations are of your feet on the floor, the hands on your lap, and the sense of your body on the chair. And see if it's possible to not try to get or feel anything. In other words, we're not trying to achieve any special state. So we're not trying to be happy or blissful or anything like that. Simply noticing what it feels like to be sitting here, tuning into these body sensations. And then maybe at a certain point, gathering your attention and focusing on the breath. And you may notice the breath moving in and out of the body at the nose, in the nostrils. And there may be sensations if you want to notice in the chest as well. And also down in the abdomen, sometimes the breath, the in-breath and the out-breath give sensations down in the abdomen. See if you can be aware of these as well. Just focusing on the raw sensations of the breath. So we're not thinking about the breath, but trying to feel the sensations that accompany each in-breath and each out-breath. And then if the mind wanders away from the breath, away from where you had intended it to be, then simply acknowledge where the mind has gone and then gently escort the attention back to the breath. And then at a certain point, expand the attention again to the whole body, sitting here, noticing all the sensations of sitting and breathing, sense of coming home to the body. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes if they've been closed and taking in the room again. So one of the interesting things about mindfulness, it can be cultivated, and has been over centuries, by doing these short meditations. Some people spend a long time each day doing meditations, but other people find that just taking a little bit of time each day to do something like that is sufficient, and that once they've gone to a special place, a chair or a cushion or a stool, simply to focus on their breath or their body, then they can decide then, when they get there, how long to spend, whether it's a minute, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It's hard to get there. It's hard to get from bed to meditate. I don't know whether you've noticed that, if you've ever tried to meditate. But it's also hard if you think that something's got to happen. You know, if after 10 seconds you're going, okay, well, I haven't been, I don't feel blissed out yet. How long is this going to take? All right, I'll give it another 5 seconds. Yeah. It turns out that just the difference between 0 and 1 in terms of practice is probably more important than the difference between 1 and 5 or 5 and 10 in terms of the number of minutes. Getting to a place where you just give yourself a moment to cultivate the art of stillness is hard. And then the other thing is that distractions come up. It might be noise outside or noise from inside your head, like things you meant to do. There's no better way to discover all the things you've meant to do over the last little while than actually meditate. They come crowding in because your mind is really good at reminding you about things that you've forgotten. And when they've dealt with all the things you've forgotten from yesterday, they dig up the things you didn't do from last week, last month, or the relationship that didn't go right 10 years ago, whatever it was, school or college. It's amazing. The mind is really good at bringing you stuff. And this is the nub of why it turns out that just paying attention seems to increase well-being and happiness. Because normally, the mind and the things we haven't done, the unfinished business, so much sets the agenda for ourselves that it leaves us constantly in a slightly dissatisfied state. We're hardly ever, in a sense, in a state in which we feel just okay right now. Because there's so much to do. And we know that feeling about when we had exams and we had to put everything else on hold in order to focus, or write a thesis, or write a dissertation, and we've got everything else that's got to be on hold. I'm sorry to remind you about that. But everything else had to be on hold. And it was sensible then to say, no, I can't do that, I can't do that. Now, if that was only for the period of doing that project, that would have been fine. The trouble is it becomes a habit. That even now from the age of 4 or 5, kids are being assessed and so on. And we were part of that in our school life, in which everything was contingent. Everything was about, if you do this, as Nic said, if you do this, then you'll be happy, rather than, as he said, putting things the other way around. And mindfulness enables us to be more aware of all those things pressing in and then having more choice about them. And that means that when a distraction comes up, we actually, in that moment, instead of just having the impulse to satisfy that, to answer the email or to do something that is the impulse of the moment, we have more choice. Why do we have more choice? Because by spending a few moments each day practicing attending, mind wandering will start up, the mind will start to distract, and that's exactly the training you need. So mindfulness and meditation is not about clearing the mind. It's actually not about clearing the mind. If you could clear the mind, you'd have a nice empty mind, but you'd never have any practice. Having a clear mind would be like going to the gym and finding no equipment there. You go to the gym because there's resistance training. You've got something to push against or pull against in order to train the muscle. So training the attentional muscle of the mind, you need mind wandering in order to notice your mind has gone, practice bringing it back, and doing that over and over and over again. And gradually you discern the patterns of the mind, you discern what's motivationally really salient for me, what is it that drags myself off, and in that way, learning to bring yourself back to give yourself more choice. And for a mind that sets you all this agenda, all these things that you've got to do, it's really incredibly liberating to discover that you can free yourself from that. We're now about to start a large project of introducing mindfulness to schools. And one of the things that we were having to deal with introducing mindfulness to schools is this idea that, well-being is just an option. That is, we've got to teach the children trigonometry, got to teach them maths, got to teach them the STEM subjects, because if they don't get that, they'll fail. And there was a certain government minister who was famously, recently, he was deposed as Minister of Education, but he was famously anti-well-being in schools. But interestingly, the agenda crept in again under the entrepreneurship agenda, because people were very in favour of training new entrepreneurs in schools. Well, it turned out that for entrepreneurship, you need focus and creativity, and all of those things are helped by well-being. And so it came back on the agenda through another route. But one of the obvious things that are obvious to teachers anyway is that although teachers will tell children to pay attention, they never train them how. And so and paying attention is foundational. They call it trigonometry are the hard skills, and mindfulness and well-being are the soft skills. It turns out, actually, that learning to pay attention is foundational for all learning. And the children who have been involved in the project so far comment spontaneously on their ability to focus more on what it is to notice their distractions, not that they instantly become angels and never distract themselves. I don't know whether angels don't distract themselves, but anyway, let's pretend that they don't. But that they have a slightly more degree of choice about all the things that would normally take them away from the things they do. So they do a 3-minute breathing space as they walk into a lesson where they hate the teacher, for example. And it's given that the children in our country are now doing this, maybe we'll finish with a 3-minute breathing space, and then I'll be quiet and give the stage to Miriam. So here's a 3-minute breathing space that you can carry out any time of day or night. And rather like the other one, it starts by just focusing on where you are right now. Sometimes I'm asked to do emergency meditations before finals for people, and actually focusing on the soles of your feet is probably the best emergency meditation you could do, especially when you can't sleep at night. But anyway, here is the 3-minute breathing space. So it starts by just becoming aware of your body, and in that way, you're stepping out of automatic pilot. And then asking yourself, what's going on in my mind and body right now? So what thoughts might be around? What feelings are here? And sort of tuning into the weather pattern in your mind and body right now. and allowing things to be just as they are for this moment. So this is the first step of the breathing space, acknowledging how things are, seeing them clearly. And then shifting to step 2 of this 3-minute breathing space by focusing on the breath, just like we were doing before. Either at the tip of the nose or the chest or the abdomen. Gathering the attention in this one place, the breath. And if the mind wanders, just escorting it back. And then step 3 of the breathing space, expanding the attention to the body as a whole. So aware of all the sensations from the crown of the head to the bottom of the feet and out to the surface of the skin. And accepting this body sitting here, breathing just as it is. Maybe even accepting yourself just as you are in this moment. And then at a certain point, beginning to move fingers and toes and opening your eyes if they've been closed. So there we have it. Mindfulness, an attentional training program which increases well-being and happiness, which is distinct from just reducing unhappiness, but does so by coming in rather from left field, not by trying to change unhappiness to happiness, but by asking you to attend in a sustained way that then allows you to distinguish all these things that would tend to distract you, all these unfinished business, and for that moment, allowing them just to come and go as mental events, give you more choice about where your mind is. Happiness seems to emerge from that. And that's really quite miraculous for some people. Thank you.
Mark's run away, but don't worry, we'll get him later. I might go straight on to Miriam now, and then that will give us plenty of time for a panel discussion at the end. So without further ado, we've tracked down Miriam's slides. And finally, Miriam Akhtar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That's a bit of mindfulness meditation. I think it did wonders for my slide presentation, brought it back to life. So yes, I am a positive psychologist, and I work in a different way to clinical psychologists. So clinical psychologists, therapists are mainly working over here in the disease model or the medical model with a goal of getting towards neutral or the absence of disorder, of illness. But as a positive psychologist, the way I work is that I like to help people go beyond absence into the presence of well-being, be it strengths, well-being, resilience, optimism, whatever it is. So, it's working. What does it mean to be happy? Well, positive psychology is the science of happiness, so I could tell you that there are a number of formulae for happiness, one of which is H equals S plus C plus V. Happiness equals your set range, the circumstances in your life, and a voluntary part, and that's made up of whether you're more optimistic or more pessimistic and the activities that you engage in. And another recipe or equation for happiness, SWB equals SWL plus PA minus NA. So SWB is subjective well-being, is a scientific term for happiness, equals SWL, so this is satisfaction with life. And this is about how you rate your happiness. Are you where you want to be, or is there a gap between where you are now and where you'd like to be? and plus PA minus NA, this is positive affect minus negative affect. It's the balance of positive emotions to negative emotions that you have in your life. And so what else does it mean to be happy? Well, I could tell you that there are 2 dimensions to authentic happiness. There's hedonic well-being. This is the sort of feel-good factor, the feeling good side of your happiness. It's about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. It's about enjoyment. And this is, you could refer to this as almost like the peak of happiness. And there's another deeper type of happiness, which is eudaimonic well-being. And this is the sort of happiness that comes from having a sense of meaning, engagement, and fulfillment in life. And I could also give you a recipe for happiness. I once came to Oxford to interview Emeritus Professor Michael Argyll, who was one of the first psychologists to work in the field. And I asked him what his personal recipe was for happiness. And he said it was this, Scottish country dancing, which is to music, which lifts the mood. It's physical, so it gets those endorphins flowing. And it's social as well, so it gives you that connection. So you could probably say that Scottish country dancing delivers all 5 ways to well-being. But when it comes to happiness, what I consider personally to be the most important aspect of happiness is expressed in the words of one of the founding positive psychologists, Chris Peterson, and it's this: happiness is not a spectator sport. If you want to be happy, you need to go beyond intellectual curiosity. You've got to go beyond reading about happiness, studying it, evaluating it, to really sort of living it, practicing it. You have to get out of the spectator stand and onto the pitch to play. Or as the Dalai Lama says, happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions. And I like to use a metaphor to illustrate this, which I find very helpful. If you just imagine your resilience is like the water level in a lake or a reservoir, and there's rocky times ahead. If your resilience is low, you're more likely to crash into those rocks. But if you drip feed positivity, positive emotions into your reservoir, the level of your resilience comes up, and then you're more able to sail over life's tough times. And that's what positive psychology tools are like. They're like the upwards arrows. So learning optimism, playing to your strengths, different ways of cultivating positive emotions, all act as upwards arrows that raise your level of resilience and well-being, so you're more able to cope positively with difficult phases in life. And I'd like to tell you the story of Adam. I came to know about Adam's story through his sister, Tara, who wrote a book called Standing on My Brother's Shoulders. It's coming out later on this year, and I wrote the epilogue to it. Adam came to Oxford to read chemistry at Balliol College, just next door. He was very bright, talented, popular, a very able student. And in the middle of his first term here, he threw himself out of the window and died a couple of days later from his injuries. Now, Adam, he was probably suffering from anxiety or depression, we don't know, it hadn't been diagnosed. He'd had a very good education, but he'd never received a positive education in the things that would grow his mental health, to grow and protect his mental health. Those upwards arrows that positive psychology tools like optimism and strengths and cultivating positive emotions do. Now, this was back in the late 80s, but still today, if you go to the doctor because you're depressed, You're likely to be offered antidepressants, the chemical approach, which has side effects or maybe has no effect at all, or you're likely to be offered sessions with a therapist where you might explore your unhappiness and maybe find yourself marinating in the source of your pain. So there's been a lot of work around removing stigma associated with mental illness, but I think it has to go much further than that, much further than awareness. We need to make the positive psychology tools, the knowledge, available and accessible to everyone. And there is cause for optimism. My favourite piece of neuroscience shows that an 8-week course in mindfulness meditation grows the left prefrontal cortex, which is about here. So, and this is the area of the brain where positive emotions are activated. So through mindfulness meditation, for example, you can grow your capacity for positive emotions, for happiness. And research has also shown that positive psychology interventions not only help to grow your well-being, but also to reduce symptoms of depression. And it's because of people like Adam that I've made it my purpose in life to spread the knowledge about these positive psychology tools, communicate the science of well-being, to enable people to raise and recover their well-being. And I've done this in books like Positive Psychology for Overcoming Depression, Self-Help Strategies for Happiness, Inner Strength and Well-being. A very long title, but because it shows how you can use positive psychology interventions in both senses to raise and recover well-being. And I've also done it in courses like this. This is the Happiness Habits. It's a well-being program that runs in communities. I've also run it in workplaces as well, with sessions on positive emotions, strengths, finding meaning and purpose, nurturing positive relationships, learning optimism, building resilience, and setting goals, setting a positive direction. So all kinds of ways of evidence-based ways to practice the tools that will put you on the path to happiness. So now I would actually like to invite you to leave the Spectator stand and get onto the pitch and practice some of these tools. I'd like us to do one of the probably the best known positive psychology intervention. It's called 3 Good Things, and it involves reflecting on 3 things that are good in your life. It could be something big that's good, like, your plans for the future. It could be something small, like having a laugh with someone. It could be something that you're grateful for, or someone that you're grateful to. Or it could be something that's gone well, and thinking about what your role was in making the thing go well. So I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself to someone you're sitting next to. And be inclusive, and just reflect on what are your 3 good things right now. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do that. Let's just bring that to a close.
That's the problem with those, is doing the dancing.
So what 3 good things does is that it draws our attention to the things that are positive in our lives. Our brains have got a negativity bias, so we're wired to notice what's wrong before we notice what's right. And this has an evolutionary purpose, so that we're not so delighted and absorbed in the wonderful sunset that we fail to notice the runaway truck that's heading in our direction. And 3 Good Things belongs to a family of interventions that go under the heading of gratitude. And gratitude is the art of noticing the positive. Happiness comes from wanting what you have. And it's a really powerful tool. So powerful that Sonia Lyubomirsky, the author of The How of Happiness, says that it's a meta-strategy for happiness. It's on a whole superior level of strategy. And you can see that gratitude is associated with many benefits, from increased positive emotions, happiness, life satisfaction, and it reduces anxiety, depression, materialism, envy, etc. So I've been keeping gratitude journals for about the last 15 years or so, and it was the most important thing for increasing my happiness. I went from a mindset of scarcity, where I was really aware of everything that was missing in my life, to one of abundance. And it was gratitude. Gratitude was the practice that really flicked the switch. So gratitude is one happiness habit, and it goes hand in hand with this one, savouring. So you know the usual meaning of savouring. In positive psychology, savouring is the capacity to attend to and appreciate and enhance the positive experiences in our lives. It's about maximising enjoyment from a positive experience, squeezing all the juice out of that positive experience. And it comes in all kinds of forms: basking, marvelling, relishing, luxuriating, cherishing, and feasting. So savouring is another happiness habit. And I'd just like to reflect, as we come to the end, on another happiness habit. And this is summed up really in the words, again, by Chris Peterson. He said he could sum up the whole of the science of happiness in 3 words: other people matter. And it's so true. It's one of the 5 ways to well-being. And one thing that we know, that the common characteristic of the top 10% of happy people is that they have good close relationships and active social lives. So you can really see the importance of relationships. So we're going to do a really brief cherishing of a relationship. So I'd just like you to think of someone that you value, that you appreciate, and name 3 positive things. What are 3 positive things that you value in that individual? So just turn back to the person you were speaking to before, and think of someone you value. Who is it? You know, a friend, a partner. I hope you relished a little bit of cherishing of positive relationships. Thank you. So what does it mean to be happy? It means practicing happiness habits like gratitude, like savouring, and like cherishing relationships. And if you do that, not only will you be understanding what happiness means, you'll truly be living it too. Done. We're done.
Fantastic. Right, now I'm sure that you've all been ticking over, thinking about some questions for our illustrious panel. What we're actually going to do is we're going to move their chairs so that you get a full frontal view of our panel. While they do that, think about those questions, and I'm going to pose one to them as we move the chairs over, which is, if they had known as students what they know now, what would they have done differently in the years kind of during the time they were students and the years following? So what would they have done differently if they knew when they were your age what they know now about happiness? And while they get settled, I guess I'll probably answer. You can probably work this out for yourselves, but given that I managed to volunteer for all sorts of jobs for which I was desperately unsuited, including being a buyer of car parts, yes, my role was to say no a lot, and I only lasted 8 months. That was not a good choice. So what I would say to you, when you choose your first job, think about what you really enjoy, and you will know what it is because you probably spend a lot of your spare time doing it now. I mean, it's the things that you kind of don't really think about as work, the things that you kind of just enjoy doing. Find those things in the jobs that you have and the jobs that you look for, and then hopefully you will get a lot of enjoyment out of life. So I'm now going to hand it over to the panel. If you knew now, yeah, you got it, haven't you? If when you were a student you knew a lot more about happiness, what would you have done differently? So I'm going to...
Okay. I think I would have kept a better balance, I think, between work and play. That's one thing I would have done. And I wouldn't have bothered embarking on the PhD, which I did give up in the end, because I realised it was for extrinsic motivation. It was more for getting the title, etc.
Stationary.
And I think doing the things that bring meaning into your life and playing to your strengths as well. So that's what I would have done differently.
I think I would have... It took me a long time before I actually started reading novels again. I'd done English at A-level, and that really killed my love of novels. And it took me a long time. I used to read textbooks. I would read textbooks. Pathetic, really, but yeah, textbooks. But then gradually I discovered that a novel was like something, it was like watching television, but you could choose when the next episode was going to be. So you didn't have to wait a week. And it took me a long time, probably until my 30s, before I got back to reading novels. Yeah.
I have no idea. I sort of feel my career has been a random walk, and I quite like that. I did have a piece of advice from someone called Charles Handy, who was a professor at London Business School when I was young. He knew my uncle, and he said, try many things. And he said, unless you're a sportsman, and he was talking to a young man, and he then said, men don't achieve much till their 40s, so try a lot of things, and then things will come together. And I would love to say that was purely planned, but there was a lot of randomness in what I did. And it kind of came together. I basically followed interests, and I don't know. So I don't know what I would do differently for my career. I do differently with relationships with women, but that's a different thing altogether.
Well, we'll come on to that later. So does anybody have any questions from the floor? Yes.
This is mainly for Miriam, but for anyone else. So you talked a lot about resilience and playing strands and gratitude, but how can students develop resilience or any of those other characteristics?
Well, I gave you quite a list there. Find out what your strengths are and play to them. Cultivating positive emotions.
Miriam, how do you find out what your strengths are?
Oh, you do a test, darling, or just notice when you become animated. What are you passionate about? What were you good at as a child? What puts you into flow? When are you in the zone? Those are some of the clues. Or you can take a strengths test online as well if you want to measure what your positive qualities, your character strengths are. But in terms of building resilience, I think one thing that can be quite neglected is cultivating positive emotions. I think especially as students, it's all very serious. You can lose sight of playing, of having fun. And one thing, I tell you, another piece of research from positive psychology that has stayed with me is Barbara Fredrickson's work on the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. So what happens when you experience a positive emotion is that it broadens your mind and it builds resources, and it also helps to build resilience. And that piece of information changed my life, because I realized that I didn't have to stress my way to a solution, that actually you could play your way to creativity, to finding solutions. And I used to work in the media, where very, very stressful, angst-driven environment. And now, actually, when I wrote my book, I did that by, first of all, I'd always go for a walk in the park before settling down to do a piece of writing, because of that, because those positive emotions are broadening the mind and enabling you to think in creative, flexible, and productive ways. So that would be my big tip, as well as finding out what your strengths are.
Fantastic. Does anyone want to add anything about resilience?
Well, I think one of the things is taking breaks. We don't really take enough breaks. And after about, the evidence is, and it's fairly old evidence now, but nobody's bettered it, that after about 40 or 50 minutes, the brain just needs a break. But that's often when we think, I must just finish this. So, your shoulders get tight and you get in there. And actually, that's often when you make mistakes as well and lose the piece of work you're working, because you press the wrong button. Or Yeah, you press send when you didn't mean to send something. But I think taking breaks is really helpful. And there's evidence that you're learning when you're doing something. Actually, you reach an asymptote, and then you just won't get any further with something. You'll start repeating the same passage. You'll try to think, what's that sentence in my head? And you've actually said it a paragraph before, but you're now trying to find new words to say the thing you've already said. If you take a 5-minute break, often you'll, just like Miriam said, get ideas for something when you're away from it, and you'll think, that's what I meant to be doing now.
I'm nodding vigorously because I now work for a company which tries to help people sleep. And I would take it one step further. Yes, breaks, massively important, but also sleep. Please do not neglect your sleep. More and more science is coming out showing that if you don't get enough sleep, that actually can lead to the sort of emotional problems, emotional disorders, and inability to learn. So sometimes it might be, if you feel that you're tired and you're sort of nodding off, have a nap. Don't be afraid to have a nap. It's not actually ruining your productivity, it's probably consolidating your learning, particularly when you're learning loads of new stuff. And if you go into that exam having not had a good night's sleep, you're not going to perform as well. So yes, sleep, breaks, resilience, strengths.
Can I just add one more?
Yes.
I love the phrase, solve it while you walk. And I love walking, so just kind of to build on what Mark was saying, go for a quick walk around your local park or just down the street or whatever.
Great. Next question. Yes.
So firstly, I would reckon that nobody can actually achieve a long-term stable happiness. So I think there is always fluctuations. So then, do you think it is necessary to be sad sometimes? So the physical action of being sad, does it help for a long-term stable happiness?
I think I'm going to get that one.
Yeah, if we go to the poets or spiritual traditions, so one of my favourite sort of long poems is The Prophet by Carl Gibran, and he talks about that our sorrow is our joy remembered and lost, and our joy is, so the relationship between joy and sorrow is symbiotic, and I think that the people that are most attractive and to be with, I don't mean physically, I mean as in to work with or whatever, are people that have got emotional depth. And emotional depth is the ability to have an array of emotions in life, including the more uncomfortable and darker emotions. I mean, how long we spend in those, is a different matter. But I think if you experience joy, you're going to get sorrow with it. And some people prefer to choose a path without feeling so much because they can't cope with the uncomfortable emotions. But if you're going to live a full, rich, emotional life, you're going to have an array of them. And that, for me, is great. And that's not unhappiness. Experiencing, if you're not tragically sad at your mother's funeral, then that's not functional in my opinion. But I mean, I don't mean that critically, I just mean as in, that's part of the human existence, and we're all going to die and we're going to experience death, and we can't just think there's a positive side. There is a stretch to this. But that, to me, is not unhappiness. That's being human. So I guess I think they come very much together.
I think that's really true. And the important thing is what happens when you're sad or when you're angry. So a lot of the problem comes not from sadness or anger, because they're going to happen anyway. And so we can't ban sadness and anger and all these other things. But often what happens is right very close on the tail of sadness comes another feeling. We might feel guilty about being sad, or might feel angry about being sad, or we might feel ashamed to be sad. And then it's no longer sadness, it's sadness plus a lot of secondary stuff. And it's that secondary stuff that actually creates quite a lot of the depression, where sadness turns into depression. So sadness and the other emotions, as Nic was saying in his talk, are like the primary emotions are just there in our life all the time, from time to time. It's how we react to them that's important. And one of the things that happens in a mindfulness class is people begin to allow their emotions, ironically, rather than try to wall them off, and see them clearly. Somebody said it's a bit like in the old days, you used to heat houses, you had paraffin stoves, And you'd set lights, you'd put paraffin in and some sort of fuel, and then you'd light it, and you had to adjust the wick, because if the wick was too small, it wouldn't burn at all. If it was too high, too much fuel would get in, it would be a big yellow, dark, smoky flame, and it would leave a nasty residue all around when you turned it off. If you got it just right, there wasn't a residue. Now, just right is perhaps the wrong word, but for sadness, anger, negative emotions, there's a sense of, can you experience them without actually them taking you over? And acknowledge that you're angry at the moment, you're sad at the moment, this is what sadness is like, this is what anger is like, without it then creating lots of other stuff that don't belong there, which is what is actually going to get you entangled. So absolutely. I think the import of your question is exactly right. That sort of imagine that you can be happy and cheerful and sort of bright and like a little bunny. I mean, ugh, you know, who needs that, you know? But I think there's a sense of actually being, a greater sense of being at peace with yourself and noticing that that doesn't mean that you won't experience sadness. You will, and anger and all that sort of stuff. But experience those without feeling you're letting yourself down.
I'd just like to add something to what Nic and Mark have been saying. And I mentioned earlier that there are 2 dimensions to authentic happiness. Hedonic well-being, the feel-good factor, which is about experiencing an abundance of positive emotions. You could say that is probably more of a short-term happiness, because positive emotions are fleeting. They're here one moment and gone the next. They're, a moment of joy, a moment of calm. But if we look at the other dimension of happiness, eudaimonic well-being, this is the deeper and arguably more sustainable form of happiness, which is about meaning, engagement, purpose, etc. So, yeah, it's true that hedonic well-being is more short-term, but if you want to look for a more stable and possibly more sustainable form of happiness, then look to that eudaimonic well-being.
Yeah, I should say when we first set up Students for Happiness, there was a very interesting discussion about what the group should be called, and there were certain people that were very resistant to the idea of saying anything to do with happiness, for fear that we would be dismissed as sort of happy-go-lucky, frivolous students who had nothing better to do than think about what made us happy. I'm glad that happiness won out, because happiness is hugely compelling. Happiness is joyful. Happiness is great. But it's not to say that the study of happiness is just about that happy emotion. It's absolutely about the whole range. But Students for Happiness and all the other emotions wasn't so good for fitting on emotions. Next question. There was one down here. Still question?
Yes. And it's a follow-up for that one, actually, for you, Mark. To my mind, all emotions can have positive and negative elements. So, for instance, jealousy sometimes stops me from being too complacent. If I'm not jealous when my husband gets admiring glances from another woman, maybe that means I'm taking it for granted. So, do you think there are any emotions that are wholly positive or wholly negative? Like joy, for instance, if it's schadenfreude, if that can be quite an ugly emotion. Gratitude can sometimes turn to selfishness. So, do you think there are any emotions that we can feel that are wholly positive or negative? And if not, where are you drawing the line? How do you determine what is a healthy balance?
I think it's a really good question. I think probably the answer is no, that emotions have all evolved to have a purpose. That's the point that Nic made. They have a function. And it's this secondary reaction that it's worth looking at and noticing. And I noticed that you were saying this can turn into, and that can turn into, and I think that's exactly right. That's a great phrase. It can turn into something which never was there in the first place. So an emotion is like a nucleus of something which, left to itself, will come and go. As Miriam said, they're relatively temporary. But what's permanent is what we do with them. In the Buddhist, we have this idea of the second arrow. The first arrow in a battle is painful, but if a second arrow lands in exactly the same place, it's excruciating. And the idea of emotions is they're like arrows, either sent out or sent in, if they're painful, if they're negative emotions, but we often then turn into something else and fire the second arrow at ourselves, unwittingly, often as an attempt to get greater sort of sense. We actually try to make sense of things and then end up with ruminating. So I think all of these things can go in either direction, and the invitation, therefore, is to look to see what the fruits of it are. rather than making an in-principle decision whether this is good or bad, to take the spirit of your question and say, well, okay, let's just have a look and see, is this leading to a good outcome or not? What are the fruits?
And, just not to be controversial, but it's like,
be controversial if you like.
I mean, there's a nice new book actually out by Robert Biswastina and Todd Kashtan called The Upside of Our Dark Side, and there's lots of stuff in that. And I'd rather have a life filled with more enthusiasm and joy than anger and fear and things like that. So, and there's a lot about how we respond to stimuluses around us. And so we're talking quite a lot about the individual here. And I'm very interested in the systems and environments and contexts we sit in. And there are contexts for us which are going to arouse more positive emotions in us, you know, healthy organisations, healthy schools, and they're ones that are going to arouse more negative ones, you know, war zones, all sorts of things. I mean, Syria, we can think about Syria as, you know, physical health and people being killed, but the mental health scars there are going to be there for generations. And, you know, people who live in those difficult circumstances are going to have a lot more difficult emotions. So I don't think we can't lose sight of the fact that there are more positive and negative experiences for people, and more positive experiences are more characterised by more positive emotions.
Actually, with that in mind, thinking about sort of environments and contexts, we're in university. Other than enabling a group to start up called Students for Happiness, I can't help wondering whether Oxford University could be doing more for the well-being of its students. I don't know a huge amount about what it does now, but institutionally, but just having lots of exams would seem quite a stressful thing to throw at students. I just wondered if any of the panelists had any comments about how you could change or optimise the university context to sort of help with promoting well-being.
Well, I'd like to ask the audience, what do they think? What do they think? I mean, just say a phrase or a word that comes to mind.
So one of the things that also does is we have 8-week terms, and like it feels quite, you know, everything's squished into 2 months essentially. Do you think that it should be longer?
So squished. Well, I think at the moment that's a great thing. So possible longer terms. Any other examples?
Then you get longer holidays, surely.
No.
Which is a positive in mind.
Okay. Okay, that's another one. I mean, there must be lots of things. There's one up there.
They need to modernise learning. The fact that lectures are often really badly integrated into courses kind of provides this old idea that you go away and learn by yourself with books.
Okay, so the lectures aren't integrated. The lectures happen there and then the tutorials happen here and they might never mesh. Is that right? Yeah, I remember that.
What do they do well?
There we are.
I mean, learning, obviously, one of the 5 ways to well-being, surely.
Hear, hear.
There we are.
There
There's
are
another
other university counselling services that now call themselves the Wellbeing Service. I just want to say something, actually, because I was in the story that I told you about Adam earlier on. One thing I didn't mention was that he was really quite perfectionist, and he put himself under a lot of pressure. I know that from his sister. And I think that the university culture does encourage perfectionism. And is very much about results, of course, but that can be at the expense of learning and the space to grow, develop and learn. And I'm very into the work of a psychologist called Carol Dweck. She talks about fixed and growth mindsets, and a fixed mindset is more perfectionist. So people who have a fixed mindset believe that we're born with a certain amount of capabilities and that's not open to much change, whereas people who have a growth mindset know that with enough motivation, concentration and application you can become better at most things. And I think, well, you're very able individuals, but I think being in a university like Oxford can encourage you into a fixed mindset, more of a perfectionist mindset. So finding ways to be in the growth mindset, to learn from what happens, to experiment, to take a risk, to try something different and learn from that. That is something, if you can foster a growth mindset, that is something that will do a lot for the well-being of students.
I think that's a really good point. And as someone who's been to university 3 times now, I would say that the last time was the best, because I just went there to kind of enjoy it and to learn. And if you can get that out of your first visit to university, so much the better.
I have a question sort of links into that, which is, what's your opinion on compartmentalisation of emotion? Because whenever you're stressed about work, for example, when you've got other things going on, do you think it's positive or negative to be able to actually say, that stressed me out, but I need to focus on this? Or is it better to just let your emotions be as such and just like feel whatever you're feeling? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but when it comes to it.
It might be one for Mark.
Well, I think try out, see what happens. And it might differ depending on where you are on the term or where you are and what is the project you're working on. I think there are some times when you just need to almost force yourself to do something nourishing rather than just ploughing on. And that, at first, that might seem rather clunky to do something on principle because you've been working hard enough already. And that may seem like compartmentalization, but I think that's a useful compartmentalization. I can't say the word. Whereas, so the counsel to just let emotions be, I think that may be useful sometimes, but on other occasions, all that happens is you end up brooding about them and creating extra around the pure burn of that particular emotion. And so looking at the context, as Nic says, what is it that's happening now, and changing the context and seeing, I think is quite a useful thing to do. But I think trying out different strategies, yeah. I mean, in the middle of the night, I mean, everyone mentioned sleep, and the middle of the night is often a time when, you know, we just can't get to sleep, and then we tell ourselves we've got to get to sleep because it's so important to get to sleep, and that often then just compounds the problem. And one of the values of some of the meditation techniques is because you can do them with your eyes closed or your eyes open, and in the middle of the night nobody knows what you're doing anyway. You can lie there and do what the children call a beditation when they do it at schools. They call it beditation, which is basically a body scan, in which you start just focusing on the soles of your feet and move up the body. And the interesting thing is that that's good for you even if you're not able to sleep. So it does some of the same healing properties as sleep do. So most of the experience is that you suddenly become aware that, oh, where was I? And at that moment, you suddenly realize that actually, oh, you must have been asleep. But you've woken up again. Now, okay, right back to the knees. And then very often you don't get past your knees. So it's really good just to do a body scan. It gives you something else to do. And also it's focusing on your body instead of allowing the mind to be sort of going round and round itself. You know, and starting with the soles of your feet is a long way away from your head. So, quite a good idea.
Fantastic. Look, we have kind of reached 7 o'clock, and much as I don't want to cut this short, I think we need to feed our wonderful panel. So I'm going to suggest that they just all give us one takeaway point to take away with us, something to remember. We've heard loads of practical techniques this evening, but if they have one favourite thing that they hope that people will take away from tonight's session, I'll give them 2 seconds to think what that might be, and then I'll start with Miriam.
Oh, well, I'm going to come back to what I was talking about. Notice what the positives are in your life and savour them.
I think I'd say accept yourself as you are. Accept yourself as you are.
I'd say try and connect, be active, take notice, keep learning and give.
Excellent point, and I would say that all 3 of these guys have written some really wonderful stuff, so if you want to know more, Google them and read what they've written and learn and act on it. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you to Benny.
Thank you.